This is the first session on the GI tract, and we'll focus on the structure and functions of the GI tract. Now, when you're thinking about the digestive system, it begins at the mouth and it ends at the anus, and it's actually an open tube that is continuous with the exterior. So, for example, when you secrete hydrochloric acid into the stomach, you are losing hydrochloric acid from your internal milieu, or through you're altering your homeostatic acid-base balance by that acid secretion out of the body, because HCl is into the stomach, which is continuous with the exterior to the body. So the substances that we take in are therefore not inside the body until they have crossed the variety of cell membranes, whether that's some alcohol and some drugs that can cross the stomach lining, others that can cross the small intestine, and others that can cross the large intestine. They're not within the body until they've crossed those membranes into the cells and then potentially into the bloodstream or the lymphatics. And the processes include ingestion, secretion, mixing and propulsion, digestion, absorption, and excretion. And those are the processes that we're going to go through today. So therefore, when we're thinking about the four main functions of the GI tract, we're thinking about motility, the movement of the foods through our GI tract. So that's obviously through smooth muscle contraction and relaxation. We're thinking about the secretions, so the secretions of hydrochloric acid, the secretions of bicarbonate to neutralize that acid when the food reaches the small intestine. We're thinking about the secretions of the various enzymes, so carbohydratases, proteases, DNases, RNases, etc. We're thinking about that's all part of our digestion using those enzymes, and of course we've then got to absorb the products of digestion across the GI tract. So first of all, we'll start with motility. And so the smooth muscle of our GI tract maintains a constant, steady pressure on the contents of the digestive system. And this prevents the walls from becoming permanently stretched following distension. So therefore, the smooth muscle is maintaining a constant low-level contraction. Propulsion, so contraction and relaxation, helps to move the contents forward through peristalsis. And this is where you're basically getting radial contractions that propel the food along the intestinal tract. And it also helps to aid with the mixing of content with our digestive juices. We then have secretions. So if we're looking at the diagram on the right-hand side, we started with motility, so the contractions of the smooth muscle to allow our food products to be mobilized and move through the GI tract. We're thinking about our secretions of electrolytes, enzymes, and buffers into the GI tract itself, but also from the epithelial cells into the interstitial fluid and then on into the blood. So, for example, when we absorb amino acids, they have to cross the cells through the interstitial fluid and enter the blood. Likewise, our glucose molecules, for example. And this is under neural and hormonal control. We need to digest. So this is where we're using enzyme to biochemically break down our products or our digest the things that we're taking into our small intestine. And then absorption, as we've talked about, through a variety of different transporters into the blood or into the lymph if they are fat molecules. So fat is absorbed or taken into the lymphatic systems, whereas pretty much everything else goes directly into the bloodstream. So when we're looking at the four main functions, remember we're thinking motility, we're thinking secretion, we're thinking digestion, and we're thinking absorption. And so the first place that the food goes is the mouth. And this is where mastication or chewing takes place, and the initial stages of carbohydrate, that's your CHO digestion, occur. And that's by salivary amylase. So that starts to break down your carbohydrates. We then move into the stomach, where we get the initial stages of protein digestion occurring, and the hydrochloric acid that's present there, that denatures the protein, so it can become long strands of amino acids. And then we release pepsinogen, which is activated to pepsin, and that starts to digest the protein molecules into smaller peptides and into amino acids later on. In the small intestine, we have other enzymes that are released from the pancreas, that your proteases, your carbohydratases, and your lipases, and also your DNases and RNases that start to break down your products that have made it from the stomach into the small intestine. Remembering that the protein digestion has already begun in the stomach, carbohydrate digestion has already begun in the mouth, but fat and nucleic acid digestion really hasn't occurred to any degree at this point. So this is where your lipases and your DNases and RNases are kicking in. And the small intestine, so that's your duodenum, your jejunum, and your ileum. These are also the main sites of absorption of nutrients. And then we move on to the large intestine. This is where you get that final digestion processes going on, the final absorption of nutrients and also water absorption. And by absorbing lots of water, we're also concentrating our waste. So therefore, it's only about 1 litre of waste excreted per day as feces. So now we'll take a look at the general structure of the GI tract. And so, as you can see in the middle, we have just the lumen, and this is where the food is basically coming in. And then we have these mucosal layers. These are highly folded, in particular in some parts of the GI tract, and that helps to increase surface area, of course, but for efficient digestion and efficient absorption. It's modified for secretion and absorption, hence lots of those folds. And it also secretes the digestive juices. So that'll be your enzymes, for example, and your bicarbonate, for example. But also it helps to secrete the bloodborne hormones. So going the other way, so it releases the hormones into the bloodstream, and then they can go on to have a variety of effects that we'll talk about a little bit later. We then have the submucosa. So this is the mucosa on the internal part, so next to the food, you have the submucosa. This contains your connective tissue for elasticity, and it also contains your nerve networks. So you have your submucosal plexus. And the submucosal plexus is mainly sensory and mainly secretory in nature. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Because your submucosal plexus and your myenteric plexus together make up the enteric nervous system. And the enteric nervous system is basically your gut nervous system. And it can function without higher order input. So in other words, it's really the third nervous system, along with the parasympathetic, the sympathetic, and your central nervous systems. So it's thought of as a final nervous system that's separate from the others, or can act separately to the others. So we go on the final layer, on the outside bit, we have the serosa. So this helps to lubricate and prevent friction between the organs, and also performs a nice supporting role. And that helps to keep the organs in the correct place, whilst also allowing them the freedom for mixing and propulsive movements. And the final bit we're going to look at is the muscularis externa, and this is all about contraction. So this is where your smooth muscle is present, so which allows for that propulsion and mixing, so it can contract to propel the food forwards, can contract and relax to help mix the food at the same time. And then in between those two, you have the myenteric plexus nerve network. That lies between those two layers, and that is largely motor in function. So remembering we have two plexuses. We have the submucosal plexus. So there we go. Here are your plexus. Your submucosal plexus, which is mainly sensory and secretory, and your myenteric plexus, which is mainly largely motor in function. In other words, it stimulates the smooth muscle of the muscularis externa to contract and relax. So the muscularis externa, this is where we have the smooth muscle coat of the digestive system. We have an inner circular muscle, which is shown in this, the inner part. This encircles the digestive tract, and contraction of that particular part decreases the diameter, so it closes in, constricting the tube at the point of contraction. Then you have the outer longitudinal muscle. This runs longitudinally all the way along the tract, and so therefore when that contracts, it shortens the digestive tract. So in other words, the inner circular muscle constricts it, and the longer outer longitudinal muscle shortens the digestive tract. And so therefore together, the contractile activity of these smooth muscles is responsible for the propulsive movements and the mixing movements of food within the GI tract. So basically you're propelling it forward, but also mixing it through contraction of those two different types of muscles, longitudinal and circular muscles. So what about the overall regulation of digestion? We know what the overall structure is. We've got the smooth muscle there for mixing and digestion. We've got sensory areas in the mucosa, so they can sense the food products that are coming in, and we also have the submucosa. So what's actually happening? How's it all being regulated? Well, the overall communication between the different parts of the GI tract ensure the presence of sufficient secretions when an appropriate amount of food is present. So depending on the amount of food that you've taken in, you'll ensure sufficient secretions for that amount of food. So in other words, it helps to avoid the overabundance of secretions in the absence of food. And there are two main mechanisms. There's the endocrine, which is all about your hormones, and the neural, which is all about your nervous system. Remembering we have the enteric nervous system, which is the gut nervous system. So remember, the enteric nervous system, that allows for autonomous behavior of the GI tract, of the digestive system. So it can do all the functions that it needs to do on its own. So the central nervous system is not required for digestive function, although it is involved. So thinking about the parasympathetic nervous system, which stimulates GI tract motility and secretions, thinking about rest and digest, parasympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic obviously slows it down because that's your fight or flight. You really don't want the GI tract working in those situations. So the submucosal nerve plexus, remembering where that is, it's associated with mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors in the mucosa. So in other words, within the mucosa, you've got all of those pressure receptors, so that's your mechanoreceptors, and chemoreceptors, so detect fats and detect amino acids, for example. So they are telling you what products are coming in to the GI tract. And therefore the submucosal nerve plexus, because it's associated with those pressure receptors and those chemical receptors, it receives those signals of what's coming in and helps to control the hormonal and the exocrine secretion from the mucosa. Remember, the exocrine is things like your bicarbonate and your enzymes. Whereas the myenteric nervous system controls the contractions and relaxation of the smooth muscle. So in other words, one is all about hormone secretions, gastric secretions, small intestine secretions, etc. So that's your submucosal nerve plexus. And the myenteric nerve plexus is all about contractions and relaxations of the smooth muscle. So in other words, movement of food and blending of food with those exocrine secretions that have been released so that they have good access to the food and therefore can start to break it down efficiently. So this is really an overview of what's happening when we're regulating GI function. We have what are called short and long reflexes. So we'll concentrate on the short reflexes to start with. So that's within our GI tract itself. So we're thinking about our enteric nervous system. So within our internal GI tract, we have various stimuli that are coming in. So that might be initiated by changes of pH or distension, so stretch, or osmolarity, or the products of digestion, so amino acids, for example. So we're detecting through our chemoreceptors and our osmoreceptors and our stretch receptors. And this is all part of our short reflex, so the enteric nervous system. Goes to the intrinsic nerve plexus, also known as the gut brain, and that stimulates the effectors, so the smooth muscles for contraction and relaxation, and the glands for the release of enzymes, for example. And that leads to a change in contractility or secretory activity. So that's your short reflex, completely regulated through the enteric nervous system or your gut brain, with nothing going on to the central nervous system, otherwise called the extrinsic autonomic nerves, is what we'll talk about that in a second. But what can also happen is we may get external stimuli. So you might see food, smell of food, food when it's in your mouth, and also the thought of food. So all of those things can activate your central nervous system, and they can then trigger through efferent impulses the local intrinsic gut brain, stimulating the smooth muscle and the glands and changing contractility and secretory activity. But by the same token, as well as directly from those external stimuli stimulating the gut itself, those internal stimuli, the chemoreceptors, the osmoreceptors, and the mechanoreceptors, can go through long reflexes, afferent impulses coming up to the central nervous system, and then back down through the efferent impulses to activate the smooth muscles or the glands, for example. So in other words, the autonomic nervous system, which is your parasympathetic and sympathetic, it allows the central nervous system to influence motility and secretory activity. So remember, that long reflex pathway involves the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, which is obviously going to inhibit motility and secretions. So just remembering, you've got your enteric nervous system, your short reflexes, and then your long reflexes, which are involving the central nervous system. But for the gut to function, it really only requires the enteric nervous system. Doesn't mean that's all it's using, but that's all it absolutely requires.